This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Today, we're exploring a fascinating economic puzzle that challenges our intuition about efficiency and conservation. Jevons Paradox reveals a counterintuitive truth. Making something more efficient doesn't always reduce how much we use it. In fact, it often leads us to use more. Over the next few minutes, we'll uncover how this 19th century observation about coal still shapes our world today, from fuel economy to digital technology. Get ready to rethink what you thought you knew about efficiency. Chapter 1. The Coal Question. In the middle years of the 19th century, as smokestacks darkened the skies over Manchester and Birmingham, a peculiar anxiety began to grip the British establishment. The nation that had pioneered the Industrial Revolution, that had harnessed steam power to transform manufacturing, transportation, and commerce, faced an uncomfortable reckoning. Britain was running out of coal. The timing seemed paradoxical. Britain's industrial might had never been greater. Railways stretched across the countryside. Factories churned out textiles, iron, and machinery at unprecedented rates. The Royal Navy, increasingly powered by steam, projected British power across the globe. Yet precisely because of this success, thoughtful observers worried that the coal seams buried beneath British soil would not last forever. Each year saw more mines dug deeper, more tons extracted, more furnaces burning day and night. Simple arithmetic suggested the reserves had limits. Into this debate stepped William Stanley Jevons, a young economist whose unconventional career path had equipped him with unusual insights. Born in 1835 to a prosperous Liverpool family, Jevons had studied mathematics and chemistry before financial difficulties forced him to take work as an assayer at the Sydney Mint in Australia. There he gained direct experience with mining and metallurgy, practical knowledge that would prove invaluable when he later turned his attention to Britain's coal reserves. Returning to England, Jevons pursued economics with the methodical precision of a natural scientist. He was among the first economists to extensively use statistical methods, collecting and analyzing empirical data rather than relying solely on theoretical reasoning. He even invented a mechanical computing device he called the logic piano, an early attempt to mechanize logical operations, a project that revealed his innovative interdisciplinary approach to intellectual problems. In 1865, when Jevons was just 30 years old, he published a book that caused considerable stir in British policy circles. The Coal Question laid out in meticulous detail the nation's dependency on this fossil fuel and examined what might be done to extend the life of British coal reserves. The book arrived at a moment when such questions carried political weight. Members of Parliament, industrialists, and scientists all understood that Britain's economic supremacy rested on its access to cheap, abundant energy. Lose that advantage, and the nation's global position would erode. Rival powers, particularly the United States with its vast coal deposits, were already challenging British dominance in manufacturing. The question of how long British coal would last was not merely academic speculation, it was a matter of national survival. Jevons' findings painted a sobering picture. At current rates of growth, British coal reserves would face severe depletion within a century. But the coal question contained something more provocative than mere projections of resource exhaustion. Jevons tackled a proposed solution that seemed, on its face, entirely sensible. If Britain was using coal too quickly, surely the answer was to use it more efficiently. Make steam engines that extracted more work from each ton of coal. Design furnaces that wasted less heat. Improve industrial processes to reduce fuel consumption per unit of output. These efficiency improvements would stretch coal reserves further, buying time for the nation to find alternatives or discover new deposits. This logic appealed to Victorian sensibilities. Efficiency, economy, careful stewardship of resources, these were virtues the age celebrated. The great engineers of the era, men like James Watt and George Stephenson, had built their reputations on making engines more efficient. Why shouldn't the same principle apply to conserving the nation's coal supply? Jevons argued that this entire line of reasoning was wrong, not just slightly mistaken, but fundamentally backwards. Efficiency improvements would not reduce coal consumption, they would increase it. The claim seemed absurd. How could using coal more efficiently lead to burning more of it? Yet Jevons marshaled his evidence carefully. Consider the history of the steam engine itself. The early engines designed by Thomas Newcomen in the early 1700s were remarkably wasteful. They consumed enormous quantities of coal to produce relatively modest amounts of useful work. These machines found limited application, mainly pumping water out of mines where the coal was so abundant on site that fuel costs hardly mattered. Then came James Watt's innovations. Between 1765 and 1784, Watt transformed the steam engine through a series of improvements: the separate condenser, the double-acting cylinder, the parallel motion linkage, the sun and planet gear. Each innovation made the engine more efficient, extracting more mechanical work from the same amount of coal. Watt's engines used roughly 3/4 less coal per unit of work than Newcomen's designs. Here was the puzzle. Watt's improvements made steam power dramatically more efficient. According to conventional logic, this should have reduced Britain's coal consumption. But the opposite occurred. British coal production and consumption soared. In 1770, around the time Watt was developing his first improvements, Britain produced approximately 6 million tons of coal annually. By 1865, when Jevons was writing, that figure had reached 100 million tons. Coal consumption had increased more than 16-fold precisely during the period when steam engines became far more efficient. Jevons identified the mechanism clearly. Watt's improvements did not simply allow existing steam engines to use less coal. They made steam power economically viable for entirely new applications. Before Watt, steam engines were confined to a handful of uses, where fuel was essentially free or where no alternative existed. After Watt, steam power became cost-effective for textile mills, flour mills, breweries, pottery works, paper mills, and countless other industries. It powered locomotives that revolutionized transportation. It drove ships that made sailing vessels obsolete. It enabled factories to locate anywhere, not just beside fast-flowing streams that could turn water wheels. Each of these new applications consumed coal. The total consumption dwarfed any savings from improved efficiency. A more efficient engine did use less coal per hour of operation, but industries ran more engines for longer hours in more locations. The coal savings per engine were real, but they were overwhelmed by the multiplication of engines throughout the economy. Jevons put the point starkly. It is wholly a confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use of fuel is equivalent to diminished consumption. The very contrary is the truth. Efficiency improvements, by making coal cheaper and more useful, accelerated the rate at which Britain depleted its coal reserves. Far from solving the resource crisis, technological progress exacerbated it. The argument did not depend on any particular quirk of coal or steam engines. Jevons was describing a general economic principle. When you make a resource more efficient to use, you lower its effective cost. Lower costs stimulate demand. New uses become profitable that weren't profitable before. Markets expand. Consumption rises. The efficiency gains get transformed not into conservation, but into growth. British coal production data confirmed Jevons' analysis. The growth was not steady, but accelerating. As engines became more efficient through the 1800s, the rate of increase in coal consumption actually quickened. Britain mined more coal in 1860 than in 1850, and the increase from 1850 to 1860 exceeded the entire increase from 1800 to 1850. The better Britain became at using coal efficiently, the faster the resource disappeared. This pattern was not universal, however. Jevons himself recognized that the paradox required specific conditions to manifest. Agricultural productivity provides an instructive counterexample. The same period that saw explosive growth in coal consumption despite efficiency improvements also witnessed dramatic advances in farming productivity. New crop rotation techniques, improved breeding of livestock, mechanization of harvest, and better fertilizers all increased the output farmers could achieve from a given area of land. Yet this efficiency revolution in agriculture did not trigger increased food consumption the way steam engine efficiency triggered increased coal consumption. Food prices fell, but people did not respond by eating vastly more. Demand for food is relatively inelastic. There are biological limits to how much people can or want to consume. The productivity gains in agriculture instead led to fewer people working in farming, as each farmer could feed more mouths. Employment in the agricultural sector declined steadily through the 19th and 20th centuries, even as total food production grew. The contrast between coal and food reveals the conditions necessary for the paradox to occur. Three factors must align. First, technological change must increase efficiency or productivity. Second, that efficiency boost must reduce prices to consumers. Third, demand must be highly elastic. The lower price must drastically increase the quantity demanded. Coal met all three conditions. Steam engines became more efficient, making steam power cheaper. And demand for mechanical power was enormously elastic because most human activities could benefit from it if the cost were low enough. Food met the first two conditions but failed the third. Demand was inelastic, constrained by human physiology and appetite. Understanding these conditions helps explain why the paradox appears in some domains but not others, and why it manifests with particular force in general-purpose technologies that can be applied across many different activities. Jevons died in 1882, drowning in the sea off Hastings at age 46, before seeing the peak of British coal production. That came in 1913, when British mines produced 287 million tons, nearly triple the amount extracted when the coal question was published. His son, Herbert Stanley Jevons, would publish an 800-page follow-up study in 1915 examining his father's projections and the continuing questions of resource depletion. Through the 20th century, British coal output declined, accelerating after World War II. By 2000, Britain produced less coal than it had in 1700, before the Industrial Revolution began. What matters for our purposes is not Jevons' accuracy as a forecaster, but his insight into how efficiency interacts with consumption. He identified a dynamic that would repeat itself across technologies and resources for the next century and a half. The pattern shows up in energy, in transportation, in computation, in communication, essentially everywhere technological improvement has occurred. Consider lighting. The transition from candles to oil lamps to gas lighting to incandescent bulbs to fluorescent tubes to LEDs represents a staggering increase in lighting efficiency. A modern LED bulb produces the same illumination as a candle while using roughly 1,000th the energy. This should have collapsed energy consumption for lighting. Instead, we have lit up the world. Cities glow so brightly they're visible from space. Or transportation. Modern vehicles are vastly more fuel efficient than automobiles from earlier decades. Average fuel economy has approximately doubled since the 1970s. This efficiency improvement should have cut transportation fuel consumption in half. Instead, people drive more miles, own more vehicles per household, and purchase larger vehicles. The efficiency gains enabled more driving rather than less fuel consumption. The pattern appears most dramatically in computation. The first electronic computers in the 1940s performed perhaps a single calculation per watt-hour of electricity. Modern processors deliver over 1 trillion calculations for the same energy input, an efficiency improvement of roughly 1 trillion-fold. Such spectacular gains should have caused computational energy consumption to collapse. Instead, computation has become one of the fastest-growing categories of global energy demand. The mechanism Jevons identified plays out with particular clarity in artificial intelligence, where efficiency improvements are accelerating rapidly. As AI models become more efficient, requiring less computation to train and less energy to run, new applications become economically viable. Organizations deploy AI for tasks that previously weren't worth automating. Each efficiency gain expands the market, drawing in users and applications that couldn't afford the previous generation's costs. These modern examples, explored in detail in the chapters that follow, demonstrate that Jevons' insight transcends its Victorian origins. The coal question has become the compute question, but the underlying paradox remains unchanged. Efficiency enables expansion, and expansion drives consumption that overwhelms per-unit savings.
Jevons' work was largely forgotten for a century after his death. He was remembered primarily for his contributions to marginal utility theory and mathematical economics. But in the 1980s and 90s, as concerns about resource depletion and environmental impacts grew, economists rediscovered the coal question. The concept acquired various names: the rebound effect, the Kazum-Brooks postulate, and eventually Jevons Paradox. The terminology varied, but the core insight remained. Efficiency improvements by themselves do not guarantee reduced resource consumption. Understanding this paradox is essential for navigating the technological transformations currently underway. Artificial intelligence represents perhaps the most significant general-purpose technology since electricity. It meets all three conditions for the paradox to manifest: technological change increasing efficiency, decreased costs, and enormously elastic demand. If history is any guide, efficiency gains in AI will not reduce total computational energy demand. They will catalyze explosive growth in applications, drawing computation into realms of human activity that currently involve no digital technology at all. William Stanley Jevons posed his coal question in an era when Britain's dominance seemed unassailable, when the idea that the nation's coal reserves might be exhausted seemed almost unthinkable. He had the intellectual courage to look at the evidence clearly and recognize that the conventional wisdom was wrong. Efficiency would not solve the resource crisis because efficiency itself was driving consumption growth.
We face an analogous moment today. The efficiency improvements in AI are real and accelerating. What remains to be seen is whether we have learned anything from Jevons, or whether we will repeat the pattern he identified, assuming that efficiency alone will spare us from reckoning with the consequences of exponential technological growth. The following chapters examine how this paradox manifests in contemporary artificial intelligence, in economic rebound effects, infrastructure expansion, and the transformation of human work, and what these dynamics might mean for the future we are building. Chapter 2: Efficiency's Illusion. For nearly a century after William Stanley Jevons published The Coal Question, his insight about efficiency and consumption languished in obscurity. Economists remembered Jevons as a founder of marginal utility theory, but his warnings about how efficiency improvements could drive increased resource consumption were largely forgotten. That changed in the 1980s, when a new generation of researchers grappling with energy policy rediscovered his work and began to systematize what he had observed. The catalyst was the energy crisis of the 1970s. When oil prices spiked following the 1973 Arab oil embargo, and again after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, governments across the developed world launched aggressive programs to improve energy efficiency. The United States established corporate average fuel economy standards for automobiles in 1975. California's Energy Commission mandated efficiency requirements for household appliances. Similar initiatives rolled out across Europe and Japan. Energy independence became a national security priority, and efficiency improvements offered an attractive solution. But as these programs matured through the late 1970s and early 1980s, something puzzling emerged in the data. The efficiency improvements were real and measurable, Refrigerators in the 1990s used half the electricity of equivalent models from the 1970s, while providing more storage capacity. New homes required far less heating and cooling energy. Automobiles traveled significantly more miles per gallon. Yet total energy consumption kept rising.
Daniel Kazum, an economist working with energy utility data in California, noticed the pattern while analyzing the state's appliance efficiency standards. He found that when regulators required more efficient refrigerators, consumers responded in unexpected ways. They purchased larger models with more features, running them in warmer settings because the lower energy costs made that choice less expensive. Many households added second refrigerators to garages or basements. The efficiency gains per appliance were genuine, but household electricity consumption for refrigeration barely budged or even increased. The same pattern appeared across appliances. More efficient air conditioners led people to cool their homes to lower temperatures and run the systems longer into spring and fall. Efficient water heaters encouraged longer showers and more frequent laundry loads. Better insulation made it economical to heat or cool rooms that previously went unconditioned. Each improvement made energy services cheaper, and consumers responded by consuming more of them.
Leonard Brooks, chief economist at the UK Atomic Energy Authority, was reaching similar conclusions from a different angle. Brooks focused on macroeconomic effects rather than individual consumer behavior. He argued that improving energy efficiency at the microeconomic level would not reduce energy consumption at the macroeconomic level across the entire economy. Instead, efficiency improvements would make energy cheaper and more accessible, stimulating economic growth that would pull up total energy demand. A factory that reduced its energy costs through efficiency improvements would invest the savings in expansion. An economy that used energy more productively would grow faster, and that growth would drive increased energy consumption. In 1992, economist Harry Saunders synthesized these observations into what he called the Kazum-Brooks postulate. Using neoclassical growth theory, Saunders demonstrated that under a wide range of assumptions, improvements in energy efficiency tend to increase overall energy consumption rather than decrease it. The mathematical models formalized what Jevons had observed intuitively in Victorian coal mines. Efficiency lowers the effective price of energy services, stimulating demand that overwhelms the initial savings. Economists began distinguishing between direct and indirect rebound effects to clarify the mechanisms at work. The direct rebound effect occurs when efficiency improvements cause people to use more of the now cheaper resource. When cars become more fuel efficient, the cost per mile driven drops, so people drive more miles. Studies measuring the direct rebound effect for automobile fuel efficiency typically find values between 10 and 30%. Similar direct rebound effects appear in home heating and cooling. The indirect rebound effect operates through a different mechanism. When efficiency improvements reduce spending on energy, households and businesses have more money to spend on other goods and services. Those other purchases require energy to produce and deliver. A family that saves $500 a year on electricity through efficient appliances might spend that money on a vacation that requires air travel, consuming far more energy than they saved. The saved money doesn't disappear. It gets redirected to other economic activities that have their own energy footprints. Some researchers argue the total rebound effect can exceed 100%, meaning efficiency improvements ultimately increase total energy consumption. When rebound exceeds 100%, we have the full Jevons Paradox, where efficiency actively drives consumption growth. The debate about how large rebound effects are continues among economists, but few now dispute that rebound effects are real and often significant.
Nowhere is this dynamic more visible than in computation. Computational efficiency has improved by roughly 1 trillion-fold since the first electronic computers. This spectacular efficiency gain did not reduce computational energy consumption. It enabled the proliferation of computing into every aspect of modern life.
Data centers, cloud services, smartphones, embedded processors, and now artificial intelligence all exist because computing became efficient enough to be economically viable for these applications. Artificial intelligence represents the latest and perhaps most dramatic phase of this expansion. The efficiency improvements in AI over just the past decade dwarf what came before. When the Chinese company DeepSeek announced it had trained a frontier quality language model for approximately $5.6 million in computing costs compared to the $100 million or more spent by American competitors, it demonstrated how rapidly AI efficiency has advanced. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella recognized the Jevons dynamic immediately, stating, "Jevons Paradox strikes again. As AI gets more efficient and accessible, we will see its use skyrocket, turning it into a commodity we just can't get enough of."
Nadella's observation captures the essential mechanism. More efficient AI does not reduce total AI energy consumption. It expands the market for AI by making it accessible to vastly more users and applications. An AI model that costs $100 million to train attracts a limited number of organizations willing to make that investment. A model that costs $5 million opens the technology to hundreds or thousands of additional companies. The total number of AI models being trained increases. The number of queries being processed grows exponentially. The computational infrastructure required to serve this expanded market multiplies. The transistor provides an illuminating parallel. When transistors first appeared, they were expensive and used primarily where vacuum tubes were impractical. As costs dropped, transistors replaced vacuum tubes in existing applications. But cheaper, more efficient transistors enabled integrated circuits, then microprocessors, then personal computers, then mobile phones and embedded controllers. The number of transistors manufactured annually has increased from millions in the early decades to hundreds of quintillions today. Efficiency made transistors cheap enough to embed everywhere, and the market found uses for them everywhere.
Road capacity demonstrates rebound effects in physical infrastructure. Building more highways or adding lanes should reduce congestion by increasing available capacity. In practice, adding road capacity often fails to reduce congestion because it makes driving more attractive relative to alternatives. People who previously took transit, carpooled, or avoided peak hours shift to driving. The additional capacity gets consumed, sometimes within months of opening, leaving congestion levels similar to before the expansion. Transportation engineers call this induced demand, a concept that directly parallels the rebound effect in energy consumption. The historical precedent for AI following this pattern is strong. Every previous general-purpose technology, steam power, electricity, internal combustion engines, semiconductors, the Internet, has followed the Jevons pattern. Efficiency improvements drove increased usage that dwarfed the per-unit savings. Technologies that become more efficient become more useful, more accessible, and therefore more widely deployed. The deployment expands total consumption even as per-unit consumption falls. Understanding this dynamic carries crucial implications for sustainability policy. Policies focused solely on improving AI efficiency, while worthwhile for many reasons, will not automatically reduce AI's environmental footprint. Without complementary measures that constrain total deployment or put a price on computational resources that reflect their full costs, efficiency improvements will drive explosive growth. The rebound effect challenges the conventional assumption that technological progress naturally leads to reduced resource consumption. Efficiency improvements are often presented as environmental solutions. Make cars more efficient and we'll use less oil. Make AI more efficient and we'll use less energy. But if the Kazoom-Brooks postulate is correct, and historical evidence strongly suggests it is, then efficiency alone is not sufficient. The efficiency gains get channeled into expansion unless other forces constrain that expansion. Some energy economists argue for policies that actively limit consumption rather than merely promoting efficiency.
Carbon pricing, emissions caps, and strict building codes all represent attempts to constrain the rebound effect by making resource consumption expensive or regulated, regardless of efficiency improvements. These policies face political resistance precisely because they impose real constraints, while efficiency improvements are politically palatable because they promise benefits without sacrifices. William Stanley Jevons identified the paradox in coal consumption, but he recognized he was describing something fundamental about how markets respond to technological change. Daniel Kazoum, Leonard Brooks, and Harry Saunders rediscovered and formalized this insight in the context of 1980s energy policy, demonstrating that Jevons had identified a general principle rather than a historical anomaly. A century and a half after the coal question, as we watch this dynamic play out in artificial intelligence, water consumption, transportation infrastructure, and countless other domains, Jevons' insight remains as relevant as ever. The technology changes, but the underlying economic forces remain remarkably consistent. Efficiency enables expansion, and expansion drives consumption that overwhelms per-unit savings.
Chapter 3. The Physical Foundation. When Google announced in 2025 that its latest AI models consumed just 0.24 watt-hours per text query, a 33-fold efficiency improvement, the achievement represented genuine technical progress. Running the Gemini model now required the energy equivalent of watching television for 9 seconds. Optimized hardware, refined algorithms, and improved data center operations had combined to slash both energy use and carbon emissions per query. Yet, despite this remarkable gain, Google's overall carbon footprint had surged 48% since 2019, driven largely by AI infrastructure expansion. This gap between efficiency triumph and consumption reality reveals the infrastructure dimension of Jevons Paradox. The paradox operates not merely in abstract economic models, but in concrete physical systems, server farms, cooling infrastructure, electrical grids, and the massive industrial apparatus required to manufacture, power, and maintain computational systems at global scale. As AI efficiency improves, rather than shrinking this physical footprint, it justifies expanding it. Data centers consumed approximately 415 terawatt-hours of electricity globally in 2024, representing about 1.5% of worldwide electricity use. The International Energy Agency projects this figure will more than double to 945 terawatt-hours by 2030, equivalent to Japan's entire annual electricity demand. Data center electricity consumption is growing at 15% annually, more than 4 times faster than electricity consumption growth across all other sectors of the global economy. In the United States specifically, data centers could account for 12% of national electricity demand by 2028, up from 4.4% in 2023. These projections account for continuing efficiency improvements. They assume processors will become more powerful per watt, cooling systems will become more effective, and data center operators will implement increasingly sophisticated optimization techniques. Yet growth occurs because efficiency gains make computational services cheaper and more accessible, pulling them into new applications and markets that weren't previously economically viable. The architectural shift toward AI-specific infrastructure amplifies this dynamic. Accelerated servers, hardware designed specifically for AI workloads rather than general-purpose computing, account for nearly half of the projected increase in global data center electricity consumption through 2030. These specialized systems enable the training of larger models and the deployment of more sophisticated AI applications, capabilities that weren't economically viable with previous generations of general-purpose hardware. Each improvement in accelerator efficiency doesn't reduce the total number of accelerators deployed. It makes deploying more of them economically rational. Geographic concentration intensifies local impacts. Nearly half of United States data center capacity clusters in just 5 regions: Northern Virginia, Dallas-Fort Worth, Silicon Valley, Phoenix, and Chicago. This concentration creates infrastructure bottlenecks that efficiency improvements cannot resolve.
When data centers locate near each other to benefit from shared infrastructure and network effects, they collectively strain local electrical grids beyond the capacity those grids were designed to serve. Ireland provides perhaps the starkest example of how efficiency enables rather than constrains expansion. Data centers now consume 22% of the nation's total electricity, a proportion that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. This occurred despite continuous improvements in data center efficiency. Irish data centers employ the latest cooling technologies, the most efficient servers, and sophisticated management systems. The efficiency of each facility enabled the construction of more facilities until their collective demand reshaped the national electrical system. What began as an attractive destination for data centers due to cool climate and renewable energy availability has become a cautionary tale of how regional concentration can overwhelm grid capacity. The pattern repeats across regions attractive to data center development. Cool climates that reduce cooling costs, proximity to renewable energy sources, favorable regulatory environments, and robust network connectivity all draw data center construction. Once a cluster forms, it grows through positive feedback. Supporting infrastructure develops, specialized electrical substations, cooling water systems, fiber networks, which makes the region more attractive for additional data centers. Each new facility benefits from and contributes to this ecosystem, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of concentration.
This creates planning challenges that efficiency alone cannot address. Electrical utilities must forecast future demand to build generation and transmission capacity years in advance. When efficiency improvements make data center operations cheaper, more projects become viable, but forecasting exactly where and when they will be built becomes harder. Utilities that underestimate face grid instability. Utilities that overestimate waste capital on unused capacity. The rapid pace of AI development adds uncertainty, as breakthroughs in model efficiency or training techniques can suddenly make new categories of computational work economically feasible. The demand infrastructure serves extends beyond traditional enterprise computing into entirely new domains. Moltbook, an AI-only social network with over 100,000 autonomous agents posting without human intervention, illustrates how efficiency improvements enable previously unimaginable applications. The computational infrastructure supporting Moltbook would have been economically prohibitive just a few years ago. Efficiency gains made it viable, creating net new demand rather than displacing existing usage. The relationship between AI efficiency and grid demands plays out differently in different regulatory environments. In the United States, where electricity markets are relatively deregulated and data center operators can negotiate directly with utilities and power generators, the industry has significant flexibility in where to locate facilities. This produces the geographic concentration patterns, as operators cluster in regions offering the best combination of power costs, cooling efficiency, and connectivity. China's more centralized approach to both AI development and electrical infrastructure creates different dynamics. The government can coordinate data center placement with grid capacity and renewable energy development more directly than market-driven systems allow. When Chinese companies demonstrate dramatic efficiency improvements in AI training, the immediate effect is not reduced Chinese data center construction. Rather, efficiency breakthroughs expand deployment of AI across a broader range of applications and organizations, enabled by lower barriers to entry. The centralized planning allows different geographic distribution, but doesn't prevent the fundamental dynamic where efficiency catalyzes expansion. The architectural evolution toward more specialized AI hardware creates another layer of efficiency-driven expansion. Graphics processing units, originally designed for rendering computer graphics, proved remarkably well suited for the parallel computations AI requires. This was an efficiency gain. Training models on GPUs rather than central processing units reduced both time and energy consumption per training run. The result was not fewer training runs, but vastly more, as the improved economics made AI research accessible to organizations that previously couldn't afford it. Now we're seeing the next evolution. Purpose-built AI accelerators that are even more efficient than GPUs for specific types of AI workloads. Google's tensor processing units, specialized chips from companies like Cerebras and GraphCore, and custom silicon from Amazon and Microsoft all represent further efficiency improvements. Experimental systems push boundaries even further. Tsinghua University's optical computing chip operates at 12.5 gigahertz with latency measured in picoseconds, while quantum computing demonstrations on 127-qubit processors show exponential speedups for certain classes of problems. Each generation of more specialized hardware reduces the energy required to train a model of given size or run a given number of inference queries. Each also expands the market for AI by lowering the effective cost, pulling in new users and applications. This creates a manufacturing and supply chain dimension to the infrastructure expansion. More efficient AI hardware doesn't reduce the number of chips being manufactured. It increases the total volume as more organizations deploy AI capabilities. The energy and resources required to manufacture semiconductor chips, build servers, construct data centers, and deploy the supporting infrastructure all increase, even as the energy efficiency of each chip improves. The semiconductor fabrication plants themselves represent enormous infrastructure investments with decades-long operational lifespans, locking in future energy consumption regardless of chip-level efficiency improvements.
The cooling infrastructure required for data centers illustrates how efficiency improvements in one domain can drive increased consumption in others. Modern data centers use sophisticated cooling systems, liquid cooling, evaporative cooling, heat recovery, and precision airflow management that are vastly more efficient than earlier approaches. This efficiency allows data centers to operate at higher power densities, packing more servers into the same physical space. Higher densities enable more efficient use of real estate and reduce per-server costs. The result is not smaller data centers consuming less total energy, but larger facilities operating at higher densities and consuming more total power. The electrical infrastructure required to support this growth creates long-term commitments that efficiency improvements cannot reverse. When a utility builds a new substation or transmission line to serve data center load, that infrastructure will exist for decades. If efficiency improvements subsequently reduce the power consumption per computation, the infrastructure doesn't get smaller. Instead, the available capacity enables additional computational deployment. The infrastructure itself creates path dependencies that lock in higher total energy consumption.
This pattern extends to the renewable energy investments that tech companies make to offset their growing electrical demand. When a company signs a 20-year power purchase agreement for a solar or wind farm to supply its data centers, the company has committed to consuming that power. Efficiency improvements that reduce per-computation energy use don't reduce the total power consumption. They free up capacity for additional computational workload. The renewable energy infrastructure creates a floor on consumption rather than a ceiling, establishing minimum energy use that will persist regardless of efficiency gains. The physical reality of infrastructure also creates constraints that efficiency cannot overcome indefinitely. Electrical grids, cooling systems, and network capacity all have physical limits. But these constraints don't halt the expansion, they shift it geographically and temporally. When one region's grid capacity is exhausted, data centers move to regions with available capacity. When current generation infrastructure is constrained, companies invest in next-generation systems with higher capacity. The constraints channel the expansion rather than preventing it. The global distribution of AI infrastructure development reveals how these dynamics play out across different economic and regulatory contexts. Regions competing to attract data center investment face a tension between the economic benefits of hosting digital infrastructure and the burden that infrastructure places on electrical grids and local resources. Efficiency improvements make each individual facility more attractive to host, but they also enable more total facilities, potentially overwhelming the regional capacity that initially made the location attractive.
The cooling water demands of data centers add another dimension to infrastructure constraints. Many cooling systems rely on access to water for evaporative cooling or direct heat exchange. Regions with limited water resources face difficult trade-offs between supporting data center growth and maintaining water availability for other uses. Efficiency improvements in cooling technology reduce water consumption per server, but enable higher density deployments that may ultimately consume more total water. Network infrastructure creates similar dynamics. More efficient data compression and transmission protocols reduce the bandwidth required per unit of data transferred. This efficiency enables applications that generate and consume more total data, expanding network traffic despite improvements in transmission efficiency. The physical fiber optic cables, switches, and routing equipment required to handle this traffic represent substantial infrastructure investments with long operational lifespans. The manufacturing infrastructure supporting AI hardware expansion faces its own scaling challenges. Semiconductor fabrication plants cost tens of billions of dollars to build and require several years from planning to operation. Each new generation of more efficient chips requires different manufacturing processes, often necessitating entirely new fabrication facilities. The efficiency improvements in chips drive demand that justifies building these expensive plants, but the plants themselves represent enormous energy consumption and resource demands that persist for decades. Understanding this infrastructure dimension of Jevons Paradox is crucial for making realistic projections about AI's energy and environmental footprint. Forecasts based solely on efficiency improvements will systematically underestimate future demand if they don't account for how efficiency enables expansion. The physical constraints of infrastructure create real limits, but historically those limits have been overcome through geographic expansion, technological innovation in infrastructure itself, and investment in new capacity. Nothing in the current trajectory suggests those patterns will change. The 33-fold efficiency improvement Google achieved in AI query processing represents genuine progress that will continue across the industry, driven by better algorithms, specialized hardware, and refined operational practices. But the infrastructure required to support AI deployment is expanding faster than efficiency improves. The data centers being built today will operate for 20 to 30 years. The electrical grid capacity being added will serve demand for decades. The semiconductor fabrication plants under construction will produce chips for years to come. These infrastructure commitments create momentum that efficiency improvements alone cannot redirect. The question facing policymakers and industry leaders is not whether AI infrastructure will expand. The economic forces driving expansion are powerful and consistent with historical patterns observed across every major general-purpose technology. The question is whether that expansion can be managed in ways that account for the full environmental and social costs, or whether the efficiency improvements will be channeled entirely into growth, overwhelming any benefits from per-unit gains. The infrastructure decisions being made now will shape AI's physical footprint for decades, regardless of future efficiency improvements in the technology itself. Chapter 4. When productivity doesn't pay. American workers today produce nearly twice as much per hour as they did in 1975. Measured productivity has increased by 92% over 5 decades. Yet median wages, adjusted for inflation, have risen only 14% during the same period. The gap between what workers produce and what they earn has widened into a chasm. This divergence between productivity and compensation defines the central paradox of modern work. Technological improvements that make labor more productive do not automatically benefit the people performing that labor. Artificial intelligence promises to accelerate this pattern. Studies already document that developers using AI coding assistants complete tasks 21 to 26% faster. Yet employment projections show software developer jobs growing 15% through 2034 rather than shrinking. The efficiency is real. The question is where the benefits accumulate. The expectation that efficiency improvements would reduce working hours and raise living standards has deep roots in 20th century thinking.
In 1997, an influential book titled Factor 4 popularized the idea that technology could deliver a fourfold increase in efficiency that could double wealth while halving resource use. The promise seemed mathematically elegant. Better tools would allow us to produce more with less effort, creating abundance while easing burdens. Politicians, business leaders, and economists across the political spectrum embraced this vision. Technological progress would lift all boats. Rising productivity would translate seamlessly into rising prosperity. That promise accompanied earlier waves of automation too. Filing systems would reduce clerical work. Computers would automate calculations. Email would make communication instantaneous. Each technology delivered its specific efficiency claim, yet total working hours never seemed to decrease. Today's paradox is different. AI productivity gains are immediate and measurable, yet they manifest not as reduced labor demand, but as expanded scope and rising expectations. Understanding why this happens requires examining how productivity improvements flow through economic systems, and why those flows consistently bypass the workers generating the value. Consider a software developer who gains access to an AI coding assistant. A function that previously required 30 minutes might now take 10. A Berkeley study tracking 200 employees over 8 months found they worked at a faster pace, took on a broader scope of tasks, and extended work into more hours of the day, often without being asked. The developers didn't accomplish their existing workload in 1/3 the time. They attempted more complex work that wasn't previously feasible. The function that now takes 10 minutes receives comprehensive error handling the developer would have skipped before. Unit tests thoroughly exercise edge cases rather than just the happy path. The surrounding code gets refactored for consistency. The scope of what constitutes finishing the task has expanded to fill the available time. The organization, observing that developers can handle more complexity, assigns more ambitious problems. The backlog grows rather than shrinks. This transformation from creation to verification creates a distinct shift in work quality that productivity metrics miss. A developer who spends the day writing code feels more accomplished than one reviewing AI-generated code for subtle bugs, even if the latter produces more total working code. When efficiency improvements shift labor toward verification and error checking, they may increase measured productivity while decreasing intrinsic job satisfaction. The cognitive experience of verification, constantly looking for what might be wrong, differs fundamentally from the cognitive experience of creation. The temporal dimension reveals another mechanism by which productivity improvements extend rather than reduce working hours. The Berkeley study found employees using AI tools extended work into more hours of the day. When tasks can be completed quickly, the boundary between work and personal time becomes porous. An employee who can draft a report in 30 minutes using an AI writing assistant might do so at 9 in the evening from home, whereas previously they would have needed a full morning at the office. The task is easy enough, quick enough, that doing it outside traditional boundaries seems reasonable. The efficiency creates new expectations about availability that effectively extend the working day without increasing official hours or compensation. At the firm level, productivity improvements trigger expansion rather than downsizing. IBM's decision to triple entry-level engineering hiring specifically because AI tools increase developer productivity exemplifies this dynamic. The company isn't hiring engineers to do the same work faster. It's hiring because AI made previously unfeasible projects economically viable. The efficiency improvement justifies expansion rather than enabling downsizing. This corporate response reflects rational economic calculation. In competitive markets, firms that use productivity gains to reduce headcount while maintaining output risk being outcompeted by rivals that use those same gains to expand scope and market share. Morgan Stanley's projection that the software development market will grow 20% annually to reach $61 billion by 2029 reflects this mechanism at industry scale. Efficiency doesn't shrink markets, it expands them by lowering barriers to entry and making software economically viable for smaller organizations and specialized applications. The total addressable market grows as the cost per application falls, creating net new demand for developers rather than reducing it. The legal profession demonstrates how efficiency can intensify rather than reduce work while barely affecting compensation. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research examining 7,000 workplaces found A produced no statistically significant impact on hours or wages in the legal profession, despite average time savings of 3% per task. AI tools review thousands of documents in hours, work that would have required teams of junior associates weeks to complete. Rather than reducing attorney headcount, law firms conduct more comprehensive discovery because the cost barrier dropped. The productivity gain doesn't reduce billable hours, it raises thoroughness standards. Once comprehensive review becomes feasible, it becomes expected. The efficiency improvement transforms into a higher bar for adequate performance rather than time savings. Similarly, automated teller machines didn't reduce bank branches. When ATMs made routine transactions cheaper and more convenient, banks expanded into new neighborhoods and opened smaller branches because the cost structure became viable. The efficiency of handling deposits and withdrawals through machines freed human tellers to focus on more complex transactions and sales, but it didn't reduce the number of people working in banking. These examples demonstrate that efficiency improvements reliably trigger expansion in elastic markets rather than conservation. Understanding why productivity gains don't reach workers requires examining the three-way split of benefits between customers, capital, and labor. When AI makes developers 25% more productive, competitive markets push much of the benefit toward customers through lower software prices or faster product development. Companies capture gains through market expansion and higher profits. Developers might see some wage gains, but historical data suggests these will be modest compared to the productivity improvement. This distribution of benefits reflects structural features of labor markets and firm competition, not accidents of particular industries or technologies. The competitive dynamic compounds across firms. Even if an individual company wanted to take productivity gains as reduced working hours or smaller teams, competitive pressure makes that choice difficult to sustain. Companies that use efficiency to enable expansion gain market share, forcing others to match their ambition or lose position. This creates a prisoner's dilemma structure, where each firm individually would benefit from restraint, but collectively they end up in an arms race of expanded scope and accelerated timelines. The wage productivity gap has characterized developed economies since the 1970s, long before AI appeared. Worker productivity increased substantially, yet median wages stagnated. Labor's share of national income declined steadily across most developed nations. This historical pattern suggests that AI productivity improvements, even when genuine and substantial, may not translate into benefits for workers in the form of reduced hours, higher pay, or better working conditions. If anything, AI may accelerate the trend by making capital more productive relative to labor, further tilting bargaining power and value capture away from workers. At the macroeconomic level, the relationship between productivity and employment becomes even more complex. Standard economic theory suggests that productivity improvements should increase wages as workers become more valuable. But this mechanism assumes competitive labor markets where workers can capture the value they create. In practice, numerous factors constrain workers' ability to capture productivity gains. Union membership has declined from a third of the American workforce in the 1950s to roughly 10% today, weakening collective bargaining power. Labor market concentration has increased, with fewer employers competing for workers in many industries. Non-compete agreements and other contractual restrictions limit worker mobility. These structural features of modern labor markets mean that productivity gains flow toward capital and consumers rather than labor. The technological changes increasing developer productivity are accelerating. The cost to build software is dropping as AI tools reduce required labor hours. And demand for software is enormously elastic because most human activities could potentially benefit from custom software if the cost were low enough. Every business process, every consumer service, every form of human coordination could potentially be mediated by software. The addressable market is effectively unlimited, constrained only by the cost of creating software solutions. As that cost falls, the market expands. These conditions suggest full Jevons Paradox in software development. Productivity improvements driving increased total employment and expanded output rather than reduced labor demand. The mechanism operates through both new types of software that weren't previously viable and more sophisticated versions of existing software that wouldn't have been worth the development cost before AI tools. The elasticity of demand ensures that cost reductions translate into market expansion rather than labor reduction. Some organizations experiment with using productivity gains to reduce working hours, allowing employees to accomplish the same output in fewer hours. A few companies have trialed 4-day work weeks or 6-hour days while maintaining full compensation. Early results are mixed. In some cases, employees appreciate flexibility and maintain output levels. In others, reduced hours create coordination challenges. More fundamentally, these experiments face competitive pressure. If rivals use productivity gains to expand output while experimental firms maintain output and reduce hours, market share shifts toward the expanding firms, creating pressure to abandon the experiment.
The question of whether expansion is sustainable or desirable extends beyond economics into human welfare. Even if productivity improvements create more jobs rather than fewer, those jobs may be less satisfying if they involve more verification than creation, more coordination of AI outputs than direct problem solving. Workers report feeling like they're running faster to stay in place, handling more tasks with less autonomy over their time, responding to more urgent requests because response times have shortened, and maintaining constant vigilance to catch AI errors. Some researchers argue this outcome is not inevitable, but reflects choices about how to structure work and distribute gains from technological progress. Policies that cap working hours, enforce boundaries between work and personal time, or ensure productivity gains translate to wage increases could theoretically channel efficiency improvements toward human benefit. But implementing such policies requires collective action that cuts against competitive dynamics pushing toward expansion. An individual company that chooses to limit output and work hours while competitors pursue growth risks losing market position. This creates a tragedy of the commons, where the resource being depleted is human time and attention. Understanding this dynamic is essential for making sense of AI's trajectory. The productivity improvements are genuine and will continue. Software developers are measurably faster with AI assistance, and those tools will keep improving. But if historical precedent is any guide, those improvements will manifest not as a smaller software industry with fewer developers working fewer hours, but as a larger industry with more developers tackling more ambitious projects under tighter timelines.
The promise from Factor 4 that efficiency could double wealth while halving resource use assumed productivity gains would be directed toward conservation rather than expansion. That assumption ignored fundamental market dynamics. Efficiency in markets with elastic demand catalyzes growth rather than conservation. Wealth did increase, but resource use increased alongside it. Productivity did grow, but working hours remained stubbornly constant, and compensation gains lagged far behind productivity gains. The efficiency improvements were captured not by workers in the form of leisure or higher wages, but by capital and consumers in the form of expanded output and lower prices. The productivity paradox reveals that efficiency is not the same as welfare. Technology can make us dramatically more productive without making us better off in terms of stress, satisfaction, or free time. The economic gains are real, but they flow through systems that channel them toward expansion rather than toward the people performing the work. The wage productivity gap that opened in the 1970s and has widened steadily since demonstrates this pattern at the macroeconomic level.
AI represents the latest chapter in this story, not a departure from it. The question Jevons posed about coal in 1865 has become the question about knowledge work in 2026. Efficiency improvements don't reduce demand for labor or the intensity of work. They expand the scope of what's attempted, raising expectations and enlarging the domain where intervention seems worth attempting. And unless we make deliberate choices to break that cycle, choices that require coordination, collective action, and willingness to accept competitive disadvantages, the productivity improvements that should liberate us will instead intensify the demands we face, expanding output while leaving working hours unchanged and compensation patterns lagging ever further behind the value workers create. William Stanley Jevons identified a fundamental truth about technological progress. Efficiency does not equal conservation. From Victorian coal mines to modern data centers, from steam engines to artificial intelligence, the pattern remains consistent. When we make resources cheaper to use, we use more of them. The 33-fold improvement in AI query efficiency doesn't reduce total energy consumption. It justifies building more infrastructure. The 25% productivity gain from coding assistance doesn't give developers more free time. It expands what they're expected to accomplish. This paradox forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we measure progress and who benefits from technological advancement. The efficiency improvements are real, but they flow through economic systems that channel gains toward expansion rather than conservation, toward capital rather than labor, toward doing more rather than being better off. As we stand on the edge of an AI-driven transformation, Jevons reminds us that the future we build depends not on the efficiency we achieve, but on the choices we make about how to use it. Thank you for listening.